Hey everybody, it's Micaiah here, and we are joining Christy Winters and Dave the Distributist, and they are going to be having a formal, friendly debate about the question, has the sexual revolution supported by second wave feminism been good for American society? Now, the format of this debate will be broken down into 5 sections. Section 1 will be 10 minutes for opening arguments. Section 2, 5-minute rebuttal. Section 3, 20 minutes for cross-examination. Section 4 will be 30 minutes for questions and answers. And then the final section will be 5-minute summaries. My fellow moderator is JP. He will be keeping track of the chat to look for questions for the question and answer period in section 4, and I will be keeping track of the times. So introducing first, Dave, can you tell a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am Dave. I run a channel called The Distributist where I explore various critiques of modern society, coming from sort of a traditionalist and semi-reactionary crazy point of view, a lot of weird ideas explored, and a lot of sort of the modern strangeness. I attempt to explain a lot of it. I kind of run an anonymous channel to a certain extent, so my biography is going to be kind of limited necessarily here.
Okay, and Christy, could you give an introduction of yourself and what your channel is about?
Sure, I'm Kristi Winters of the eponymous channel. Also, yeah, that means Kristi Winters, yeah. My content focus is primarily on critiquing. I'm going to do atheist critiques because I myself am an atheist. I look at things through feminist critique and do a lot of analysis and critique of right-wing politics in the United States. So that's primarily what my content focuses on.
Okay, so if we are all ready to go, Dave, you got the first selection, so we will start with your
Yes.
10-minute opening arguments and begin when you're ready.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'd like to thank Micaiah B and JP for moderating, and also Christy for agreeing to have this debate. I've been really looking forward to it, but I've got a lot of material to cover, so I'm just going to push right ahead. The resolution of this debate is, has the sexual revolution supported by second-wave feminism been good for American society? And here I think we can apply some basic definitions. The sexual revolution can be defined succinctly, as dictionary.com does, as the liberalization of social and moral attitudes towards sex in Western countries during the 60s, as the women's liberation movement and contraception instigated greater experimentation with sex outside of marriage. Furthermore, the definition of second-wave feminism can be defined simply as the mainstream movement of women's liberation starting in the late 50s and carrying on into the mid-80s. With these definitions, I think the debate before us is more or less clear. I feel it necessary to clarify right off the bat what this debate is not about. Firstly, this debate is not about whether some movements who have called themselves feminist in the past have done some good at some point in history. This debate is also not about whether some good things have happened in the last 40 years. Of course, we all know the economy grows, technology always improves, but the effect of constant technological and economic progress should not prevent us from seeing a manifest social harm. We're not talking about some hypothetical feminism or some hypothetical sexual revolution that we wished had happened. This is a debate about a particular societal change and how that societal change resulted in observable detrimental outcomes to society in general. I need to enumerate my case, and I'll do this in 3 points. First, I'll make the point that the sexual revolution actually did happen. Second, that feminist leadership largely supported these changes. Third, that the sociological changes brought forth have had large and observable detrimental impacts to the American society as a whole. To start, while some might feel this first part to be unnecessary, I would like to briefly review the overwhelming amount of evidence that suggests that the period between 1965 and 1980 corresponded with enormous changes in sexual attitudes and behaviors among men and women in the First World. We can cite this through direct scholarly sources, such as the book The Sexual Revolution by Escoffier et al., and also see this repeated in Teachman 2003, Twen, Sherman, and Wells in 2015. Altogether, I would summarize the sexual revolution by the introduction of 2 attitudes, first in intellectual classes and later in middle and lower classes. These attitudes are, first, the destigmatization of extramarital sexual relationships, and two, the view that sex can be separated from monogamy and family creation. And while many exceptions do exist, endorsement of these attitudes was a hallmark of second-wave feminism. This can be readily seen through documenters of the movement, such as Bell Hooks, who point to sexual liberation as one of the primary goals of second-wave feminism. Additionally, we can also see it in prominent feminist voices of the time expressing hostility towards traditional families, such as Germaine Greer, who, after writing a book largely describing how men expressed hatred for women in traditional monogamous relationships, went on to call for, in the words of the New Yorker, sexual liberation and the dismantling of the family for utopian ends. These attitudes, in turn, derive from earlier voices of post-war feminism, like Simone de Beauvoir, who, in fact, claimed that women shouldn't even be allowed to stay at home and work as mothers. Suffice to say that hostility towards monogamous family units was common in this movement. But that being said, were there actually marked observable sociological changes beyond just attitudes? Here, again, I think that the evidence is so strong it hardly requires much time to review. We see from multiple sources that the time period between the 60s and the 80s brought about large changes, including one, an increase in casual sex rates across the West, Cheechman 2003, two, an increase in the number of lifetime sexual partners, which we see from Bigger, Brinton, and Rosenthal in 1989, three, an increase in divorced families and in cohabiting families that we see from Thornton and Young in 2001, four, an increase in single-parent families enormously, which we can see both from the Pew Research Center and from the US Census Bureau. And these are major changes in the fabric of American society. But I think the question that sort of begs itself now do these behavioral changes that we have clearly established in data actually have good or negative effects for American society? Certainly, many radical feminists and many radical feminist theorists have looked at these sociological trends that are undeniable and have speculated this might be good or liberating. Perhaps there is some sexual revolution utopia where men, women, and children can live together under some kind of new dispensation for sexuality. However, this vision of improved liberation and improved societal cohesion from the sexual revolution is just not borne out by the evidence. In fact, the effects from increasing casual sex, decreasing marriage rates, and increasing cohabitation have major negative impacts on human thriving. And there is a large amount of evidence that the impact of these new relationship structures is detrimental for both children raised in these new family structures as well as the adults who directly participated in them. First, we see from the research that an increased number of sexual partners leads to poorer marriage, an increasing likelihood of marriage dissolution and instability, and an increasing likelihood of infidelity. Overall, these are bad effects for relationships. And these poor effects on relationships translate directly into effects on children who suffer from family instability. Moreover, regardless of stability, the post-sexual revolution family arrangements have poor outcomes. Children fare poorer under single-parent and cohabiting households, as well as divorced households. This by Amato and Keith 91 and Manning and Lamb 2003. Cohabitation is unstable and bad for children, and single mother contributes to early childhood problems in development, cognitive performance, and education. Here from Dawson in 91 and Bumpus and Liu in 2000. But the impact does not stop with children. For a long time, we've observed poor psychological outcomes in adults themselves resulting from lifestyles of casual sex. We see a clear relationship between participation in casual sex and depression and drug use, along with other psychological outcomes that are poor, from Napier et al. And Klein et al. 2004 and Fielder 2014. All of which complement the idea that post-sexual revolution concepts of a liberated sexuality has had detrimental effects on the individual themselves. But in fact, I think the most interesting observable data we've seen so far has come from one paper called The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness, published in the American Economic Journal in 2009. Authors point out an astonishing decline in female happiness since 1970 over a period of increased female earnings, increased autonomy, and sexual liberation. Now, while it's important to note that the authors of the study do not think decreasing marriage rates can be directly used to explain this effect, the decrease in relationship stability and community cohesion remain the prime suspects. And in both of these effects can be linked to changing family and sexual behaviors in American society. In fact, this last point should be entirely predictable, since we've known for decades that happiness is linked strongly with relationships and community. A societal shift, like the sexual revolution, away from stable relationships to more fractious and unpredictable relationships with many fewer permanent bonds, was almost certainly going to have some kind of negative impact on women's happiness overall. And I'm sure in noting this, some feminists would join me in concluding that this is a bad result. It seems that one of the main effects of the sexual revolution was exporting pathologies of overwork and higher openness to promiscuity, classically associated with men, to women. The ironic fact remains that feminism supported a societal change that represented little more than a masculinization of work and sexual culture to the society as a whole. We all might wish things could have been better. We all might have wished things could be different, that feminism would have supported monogamy and an increased focus on the family. But once more, we are not here today to discuss the movement we wished could have happened. I think with these points, I can rest my case that the sexual revolution supported by second-wave feminism was not good for society. While I'm looking forward to hearing a robust critique in Christy's arguments, I would like to raise one more personal question I hope might be answered in this debate. Given all of this manifest data that I have cited, all of these manifest societal harms, the most disadvantaged groups in society, why has modern feminism and the modern feminist movement not spent more effort on addressing these matters? It seems that the modern feminist movement is unwilling to address the consequences of the sexual revolution, even as their predecessors were all too willing to support its implementation. While I can only speculate as to the reasons, there is room for improvement, and perhaps for cooperation in solving the problems that the sexual revolution has manifestly brought to our society. Thank you very much.
Okay. And with 13 seconds to spare. So, Christy, you may begin when you are ready.
Right, so I should say that I didn't include my references in the discussion. I do have them at the bottom of my document, and so I'm happy to provide those at the end. And if at some point in the questions you have a specific question, I'll scroll down and look those up. So, okay, I'll go ahead and start now. First, I'd like to thank our viewers for watching, to JP and Mick for moderating, and to David for his gracious and agreeable nature. Truly, all our interactions were pleasant, and for that I thank you. We are debating whether the sexual revolution has been good for American society. This is a question of values and morals. As an atheist, I don't believe in supernatural laws humans must follow. As a humanist, I put human flourishing at the center of my moral good. That is the metric that I offer to you as viewers as well. From this, we can ask, what sort of society would we need to create in order to improve human flourishing? I would argue equal treatment for all is important. Fairness is important, and especially in the terms of this debate, bodily autonomy. To the viewers, I ask you, do you value equal treatment, fairness, and bodily autonomy? Do you want an American society that allows for people to live these values freely? And if so, let's chat. The sexual revolution, as I will be defining it, it also comes from online, but it says it's the liberalization in Western countries during the 1960s of established social and moral attitudes to sex, as the women's movement and developments in contraception instigated changes in attitudes towards sex and women's sexuality, and sexual equality became an aim of society. If you said you value equal treatment, fairness, and bodily autonomy, would you also say that you're committed to the idea of sexual equality too? And here I don't mean the equality of the senses, I mean equality as sexual beings. Do you personally put more value on sexual pleasure or sexual release based on the sex of the person enjoying it? Yes or no? And do you think, if you think that sexual pleasure is valuable for everyone, then you'd have to admit that our society does not reflect that value. In contrast, the most influential source on Western social values and norms focuses only on men's sexual pleasure. In the Bible, we see that men's lives live in societies that cater to satisfying their sexual pleasure, and women's bodies are used for their sexual satisfaction with no regard for women's dignity or their human rights. Men had exclusive power to control women's bodies and their lives. God gave rules that enabled men to have a sexual release whenever they wanted, and whether or not their partner consented. Women were captured as prisoners of war and made into concubines, according to Deuteronomy. God's servants commanded the Israelites to kill all the Midianite women and the boy children, but to keep the virgin girls for themselves. Men could buy girls and give them as brides to their sons, according to Exodus, and a Hebrew girl who was raped could be sold to her rapist for 50 shekels. In Genesis, we see that Rachel and Leah gave their slave women to their husband. He impregnated them, and then they stole their babies so they could raise them as their own. And of course, King David is known for his sexual predations. American society was organized on biblical values that viewed women as subhuman sperm dumpsters, important only insofar as they could provide men with sexual release, bear their children, and keep their house in order. And that view of women is not extinct. In fact, it is still with us today. Now, I am not blaming men or women today for the sins of our sexually promiscuous forefathers. I'm pointing out that our society has maintained this biblical double standard that sex makes men into studs and women into whores. And things are a lot better for us after the sexual revolution. Before the 1960s, a man could rape his wife every night and it would not be illegal. There were no marital rape laws on the books until the 1970s, and it was still legal in North Carolina and Oklahoma until 1993. That's less than 25 years ago. Society in the 1950s saw childbirth out of wedlock as a psychological deficiency on the part of the mother. This baby scoop era saw psychological tactics being used against unwed mothers to force them to give their babies up. And for an example of this, you can watch the film Philomena about one woman's experience when in 1950s Ireland, over 60,000 babies were sold by nuns to rich American families. Domestic abuse was tolerated and often ignored by the police and the courts until feminists began agitating for changes in the 1970s. And it is against this horror of women's lives that feminists challenged these values. Now, due to the time constraints, I have to pare down the list of values that they were arguing for, but these values map onto the values I mentioned before of equal treatment, fairness, and bodily autonomy, elevating the importance of female sexual pleasure, access to medically accurate information about their bodies, access to safe and reliable contraception to prevent pregnancy and abortion services in case they need to terminate them, and economic self-determination. If you agree these ideas come out of the principles of equal treatment, fairness, and bodily autonomy, then we needed the sexual revolution to take on and to start destroying the attitudes that shame and subjugate women. Has the sexual revolution really destroyed the American family? Nope. In fact, rates of sexual behavior in marriage and divorce fluctuate over time. If you look at the statistics, youth culture, premarital sexual intercourse, and divorce rates went up in the 1920s, the roaring 1920s of America. They stabilized over the Depression era, and these numbers went down in the post-war period, but then we saw them go back up in the 1960s today. So where are we in the 21st century? Well, according to data from 2016, the U.S. divorce rate dropped for the third year in a row, reaching its lowest point in nearly 40 years. Marriage rates have increased. In 2015, there were 32.2 marriages for every 1,000 unmarried women aged 15 or older, and that's the highest number of marriages since 2009. Divorce rates are falling. The 2015 divorce rate was 16.9 divorces per 1,000 married women aged 15 or older, down from a peak of almost 23 per 1,000 divorces in 1980. The introduction of no-fault divorce laws has actually resulted in fewer women committing suicide. Estimates is that female suicide went down by 20% as a direct result of no-fault divorce. And in 2011, we saw that U.S. teenage pregnancy rates were the lowest for more than 30 years. In 2011, teenage abortion rate was 13.5 per 1,000. That was the lowest since abortion was legalized and down 69% than its peak in 1988. And when we compare U.S. poverty rates for single mothers, yes, we do see higher rates of poverty for single mothers in the United States, but we can explain that by the fact that other countries provide women with longer parental leave and more paid parental leave and higher amounts of family allowances. All of these are associated with lower poverty among all households with children. So, and we also know that the household income for the average child increased dramatically after family planning programs were introduced. Poverty rates for children fell, single-parent household numbers fell, and public assistance receipts, in other words, welfare for families fell. Yet women's bodily autonomy is still under attack today. Did you know that since 1979 in North Carolina, if a woman withdraws sex during the middle of a sex act and the man forces her to continue, he can't be prosecuted for rape? or that some sex abusers of children have been able to get away with sexual abuse because they can marry their victims. Just one example, a woman who's campaigning now to raise the age of marriage was raped as a child by 10, impregnated as 10, and she was forced to marry her rapist from her church in 1971. Trump has proposed leveling off funding for the Title X family planning program. He appointed a woman who is ideologically hostile to birth control to lead the program. And he's considering a proposal that would allow employers to forbid female employees from using their health insurance to pay for contraception. The GOP in Congress has continually tries to defund Planned Parenthood, which millions of women and men rely on for their reproductive exams and contraception, and Republicans are even continually trying to deny statutory rape victims access to Medicaid-funded abortions. We've seen recently that 5 women have suffered prolonged miscarriages, severe infections, and emotional trauma in Michigan when staff neglected their patients' health to uphold religious directives against inducing delivery. The sexual revolution was just the start of an important and valuable transformation of American society. The core challenge is the view that women's bodies and sexuality, even their quality of life, is less important than men's. And the sexual revolution was more than just good for society. It was necessary to create a country that becomes increasingly expansive in its notion of equal treatment, one that becomes more inclusive of what experiencing fairness means, and one that empowers women's bodily autonomy over the power given to churches to determine their health care or forcing women to ask permission for contraception from their bosses. Feminists said no to that. Feminists continue to say no to that. And you yourself don't have to be a feminist to say no to that. To end, I will return now to the question that I've asked you, member of the audience, that at the start of my speech. Do you value equal treatment, fairness, and bodily autonomy? Do you want an American society that allows for people to live these values fully? Feminists say yes to that. Feminists continue to say yes to that, and you yourself don't have to be a feminist to say yes to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. And so I would say how about have Dave take the first rebuttal? Does that sound fair to you two?
I'm fine with that. Yes, let's go ahead so we can kind of stagger it a little bit. So just let me know when I should start.
Okay, go ahead and start when you're ready.
Okay, so I'm glad I started this conversation by specifying what this debate is not about, because I heard a lot of things in Christy's opening arguments, namely referring to specific abuses and specific reforms that were implemented to confront those abuses that really have nothing to do with the sexual revolution, which focus on changing attitudes about premarital and extramarital sexual relationships. There's nothing about the sexual revolution that precludes any of those abuses that she mentioned being confronted in other ways. I think that we'll see this throughout the arguments, that there is an attempt to sort of mistake the progress of time that naturally occurs. Laws get further specified, we get more information, we get better means of treating things, with the specific occurrence of the sexual revolution, and try to sort of superimpose that for the reasons why the sexual revolution was good. But first, there's a lot of points I have to get to. First, to Christy's point that the sexual revolution never happened. I think this is ridiculous. We have seen fluctuations in attitudes towards premarital sex, but never to this extent. In the 1920s, did the African American community have illegitimacy rates of 72%? Out of the water different from anything we've ever seen, and they mark a huge break in human behavior that could have only ever been facilitated by the introduction of progesterone-based birth control. And again, many, many sources attest to this. This is something that actually did happen. But going straight on, I think there's 2 points I did want to get. I wanted to get specifically to the whole bodily autonomy issue. And then I wanted to segue on to the spousal rape issue, because I think they sort of illustrate the main point. I think bodily autonomy is an important value, but doesn't really tell the whole story, because we don't believe in bodily autonomy absolutely. I mean, certainly in terms of laws, we could argue in some kind of libertarian conception you should have totally bodily autonomy, but are societal trends and attitudes of what we do to our bodies actually something that we don't care about? For instance, if there was a drug revolution, we all decided that opioid use was perfectly fine, and everyone started shooting up heroin, would we not be able to call that out as a pathological instance in human society? I mean, that fundamentally pretty much has happened in many American communities, and it's been utter disaster with people ruining their lives. But technically, the decision to shoot up heroin is bodily autonomy. But we still have the ability to call specific decisions people choose to do with their bodies bad and pathological to the mainstream society. And I think the sexual revolution is evidenced by the more or less established pathologies of cohabitation and single-parent households are manifestly one such detrimental effect to society. You know, the reason why I want to kind of segue this onto the spousal rape example is I think it illustrates a really, really good point. Now, there were a lot of archaic laws concerning spousal rape, mainly around the Victorian assumption that spousal rape could only occur with spousal abuse, and therefore spousal abuse laws were sufficient to confront spousal rape. I agree, interpartner violence is a huge issue, but there's one thing that Kristi Winters is leaving out. Interpartner violence is astoundingly more common in cohabiting and single-parent families, which means that the sexual revolution itself increased by an enormous margin the amount of family structures that would encourage rape, abuse, and child abuse enormously in our society. So while we can talk about how, okay, spousal rape laws technically happened after the sexual revolution, so we can attribute those reforms to the sexual revolution, we're talking about the main effect of the phenomenon, increasing both the risk to children and women by increasing the incidence of cohabitation and single-parent families where this abuse is all the more common. And so we see that, like, aside from taking on specific points, specific abuses, when we can look at specific abuses and see, okay, this was very tragic. It happened before the sexual revolution, and then we fixed it. That's very fine, and I applaud any attempts to reform the system. But when we look at the actual phenomenon, as Kristi defined it, as I defined it, and look at the effects on the whole, it is overwhelmingly clear that the main effect caused all of these problems to exacerbate themselves. It exacerbated promiscuity, STD transmission, and interpartner violence, which was one of the reforms that was supposedly one of the good effects of it. But at the end of the day, all the feminist movement has to show for this are band-aids being put upon a larger negative impact of the sexual revolution. And I think that if we want to do more than just put band-aids on this problem, we have to start with acknowledging that the main effect of the sexual revolution was overwhelmingly detrimental to society.
And time.
Thank you.
Okay, so Kristi, you can begin when you're ready with your rebuttal.
All right, so my mic is on. All right, those were some interesting statements. First of all, the definition can be, two definitions were provided, and my answer fits the definition that I gave, that it was a liberalization of movements in the 1960s that challenged established social norms about sex, but it also included attitudes, changing in attitudes towards sex, women's sexuality, and sexual equality that became an aim of society. Now, I know for Dave, it's very useful to only look at marriage rates from the 1960s until the sort of the 1990s. I noticed that most of your information is kind of dated. You've got 2003, 1989, 2001. I think your most recent one is from 2014. And as I demonstrated with the data from 2015 and 2011, these trends vary over time. We've seen marriage rates go up in the 21st century. We've seen teenage pregnancy rates go down. And so when we think about the role of sexual liberation across American society, it is far wider than simply framing it that it's a one man, one woman, and kids. And those are the only areas in society that are affected by sexual changes. Yes, these issues are important and challenging, but we see divorce rates going down, we see marriage rates going up. So on a systematic level, what we might have been seeing in terms of the patterns of the 1980s and into the 90s, this seems to be turning around. So the idea that somehow feminism has ruined marriage, ruined the family, and that it's encouraging divorce, I just don't think is borne out by 21st century evidence. Now, in terms of should we just be looking at, this period from the 1960s to the 1980s? No, I think even if you don't have the same amount of change over time, if you do take a step back, what you see is that from the 1920s, we saw we saw a challenge of what Victorian values were, and we saw progress being made, and then we saw a period of retrenchment and then period of change. Now we seem to be in another phase where people are kind of settling down again. This might just be a natural part of modern life. In terms of the sociological results, while it might be the case that I don't want to doubt your studies that there are issues about with kids who have single parent households. The fact is we've always had kids with single parent households, whether it was through death or through practices of bigamy, which were very, very popular in the 19th century, where men were getting married more than once. So in other words, the idea that somehow if we just remove the sexual revolution, that this would fix the problems with marriage, that's really not the issue. I can hear you typing, by the way, so you might want to mute yourself. I think the issue here about, feminism's greatest achievement was to make women into overworking, promiscuous men. This isn't any kind of solution. With my perspective about the way that feminism focuses on equality, fair treatment, and bodily autonomy, it gives us values to aim for. It gives us metrics to look for. And instead of just hurling names or making characterizations, it's actually looking to solve problems, and not just solve problems anymore for women who are bourgeois and white, but feminism now in terms of bodily autonomy reaches a far wider audience than it did. And that wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for the sexual revolution. The other issue that we can discuss here is, let me go back, because quite a lot of your stuff was factual, and quoting Simone de Beauvoir, that's fine. So I guess I'll just, in my closing minute, I'll just restate what I think is my main objection. I understand tactically why you want to narrowly define feminism's impact to young kids and to stability in relationships. But not everybody has kids. So your argument really doesn't have an impact or address those lives at all. Mine does. There's also the issue that people only raise kids, for, let's say, 20 years out of maybe a 70 or 80-year life. That's a lot of other life to be focused on. And in terms of where we have come, women's sexual pleasure, the fact that sex is more enjoyable, I think that this is a quality of life issue that I am willing to defend. I think I would much rather live in a society that embraces sexuality and finds it healthy and finds healthy ways for people to practice it safely with education, rather than going back to the 1950s where people were closeted, where women could be sexually harassed without any problems. And, there was a lot of inequality and a lot more strife. So I will just wrap up there and we can move on then to the next bit. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So up next is going to be the cross section. And since Dave went first for the opening, we will be having Christy go first for the this part. So it will be, give me 1 second. It will be a 20-minute. Oh, sorry.
Do we alternate? Do we alternate questions, or do we have the reserved blocks?
I thought alternate.
Okay.
Alternate. Okay. Awesome.
So the only main contention is no interrupting during the question or the answer. Is that okay for both of you?
And how long, so do we have, is it a timed period where we just go back and forth and it's a very free-flowing thing? Is that the idea? Or is it timed after 5 minutes? Probably more free-flowing, so sorry. That's okay. I'll just ask my first question. We'll see how it goes.
Okay. So, it's
Dave,
20 minutes.
Okay. Dave, I was wondering if you could speak to how your critique is relevant for people who don't have kids.
Is that the question?
Yep.
Oh, because everybody is a kid and everyone is raised by a family. And I showed clearly through at least 5 or 6 sources that the impacts of these increasingly unstable relationships on children is just manifestly bad. It's bad psychologically, it's bad for cognitive outcomes, it's bad for future economic outcomes, right? So you might not be a person who wants to have kids, but rest assured you are raised in a family. And if that family is falling apart and your mother has 3 boyfriends in and out that abuse you and rape you, you're not going to have good outcomes in your life, regardless of whether you're gay, straight, or decide to have kids yourself. So everybody is a child, everyone's raised in a family, and the utter destruction of American families due to the sexual revolution impacts everybody.
Right. Can I follow up?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So leaving aside the fact that everyone is a kid, Why is your argument at all relevant to people who aren't married, aren't in relationships, or don't have kids?
Well, you're asking me whether worse cognitive outcomes and worse psychological outcomes
No,
for
I'm
an
talking about
entirely new generation of Americans affects.
No, I'm talking about the society that you live in as an individual. What is the benefit of living, like how is stopping the sexual revolution, how would that make the life of a person who wasn't going to have kids better?
He's not going to grow up in a society that has an enormous amount of people who have psychological problems and need to be medicated by massive amounts of SSRIs. I mean, I don't know. We're not just these detached individuals. We're part of a greater society, right? If the society falls apart, I can't just stay in my little child-free bubble and go, okay, well, screw the people with families. I'm good. I think it's fairly straightforward.
Okay, I asked my follow-up, so.
Okay, so Dave?
Okay, I have some questions about the statistics that Christy cited. So you say that we've always had single-parent families, but I mean, the argument was really about the statistical extent. I mean, we've always had single-parent families since the beginning of time, but have there been communities with 73 to 80% single-parent families? I mean, the statistics just don't seem to bear this out. And moreover, you said the marriage rates are up since 2009. I mean, this is a statistical blip. I mean, they went down in 2009 due to the recession. But if we look at the marriage rates per population from the American prospect, right, we see that starting in 1979, they just take a steady decline. And then starting in 2008, there's this little blip up that accounts for about 1 or 2% of the entire effect we've seen since 1980. So I guess I'm just questioning, are you claiming that like the sexual revolution has increased marriage rates, or that the marriage rate we're seeing now isn't anything in line to a historical average we saw before this time period?
Okay, so there are two questions there. Hold on, I was listening and trying to look up some of my notes again. Could you just very quickly restate in short sentences?
Yeah, so you made two claims. One, that marriage rates are up since 2009, and that we've always had single-parent families. My follow-up is that, do you think the statistical evidence we have shows that our marriage rate is nowhere near the historical marriage rate before 1980?
Okay, and the second part?
Well, I mean, do you think, I mean, well, I guess that sort of is the question.
Okay, because I was starting to write the impact of, and then I lost it. So the question is, do you think that I think the marriage rates are similar now to where they were in 1980?
No, before 1980. Do you think the marriage rate? I mean, I'm just asking if you're contesting the fact that the marriage rates have precipitously dropped since 1980, even taken into account the tick up after 2009, which is, is that what you're contesting?
Well, as I can cite right here, the marriage rates increased in 2015. There were 32.2 for every 1,000 unmarried women, and that was the highest number of marriages since 2009. So
yes, I know.
Right. So if your contention is that sexual revolution has attacked the institution or is undermining the institution of marriage, we should see a secular decline. Instead, what we are seeing is variation. So the variation we observe can't be causally linked to feminism, or we would see a steady decline over time. There must be other things going on that affect the marriage rate. And so I think that just pointing to an event, the social event that started to happen in the 1960s and maybe lasted to the 1980s to explain divorce rates in the 21st century is quite tenuous. I think we see changes over time, and I don't think the events of the 1960s and 80s can explain what we're observing now.
Yeah, I think I agree there's multiple sources of the change. It just seems to me that the obvious, what we're seeing basically is a main deterministic trend with a statistical addition of noise. And I think the 2009, 2015, if you look at the statistics following noise, because the main effect, like 90% of the effect, is a steady decline since 1980.
Okay.
But
that's conjecture.
Okay. No, it's not. You can just go to the American Prospect and see the numbers. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so is there anything left on that question, or should we move on to the next question, the cross-examination?
Let Christy
Okay.
have the next question.
Okay, so Christy.
Yes. So my question for you is, in your ideal world, what does women's sexuality look like?
Women's sexuality and men's sexuality looks exactly the same. It's a sexuality focused on rearing communities, of rearing children, of being of service to others, of giving oneself to a larger cause. And the larger cause is the family. Now, I know that we brought up a lot of this sexual autonomy stuff, but it didn't really answer the question of what we should be choosing to use our autonomy for. And for me, autonomy should be used altruistically, to give to a family rather than to explore numbers of lifetime sexual partners. And I think largely one of the mistakes, like I said before in my introduction, was, okay, we had men who had higher promiscuity rates before the sexual revolution than women do. I agree that was unfair. But why was the main focus of people like Erica Zhang, of Gloria Steinem, to take men's behavior and export it onto women, as opposed to taking women's behavior and teaching men about it? Because the women had it right before the sexual revolution, not men.
Okay, and is that the end of your response?
Yeah, sorry. Should I punctuate my responses with something to let you know that
I
they're
just
done?
wanted
Okay.
sorry. I just wanted to make sure so we could keep things
Pardon
flowing.
me.
No problem. So, Christy, do you have any follow-up to that? Okay, so Dave, next question for Christy.
I guess I'd like to ask you about the paradox of declining female happiness, because this sort of just struck me as like a big burning data point. We've seen that women in the 60s and 70s and before were much happier with their lives than women are now. And it's been declining precipitously, and we can observe this. And I guess I'm wondering, I mean, what's your reaction to this reality we're facing, where people are locked in unstable relationships and unstable communities, and they're manifestly making them miserable? You know, I guess I'm just wondering, you know, feminism claims to take women's lived experiences seriously, but I've just seen no reaction to the lived experiences of women, insofar as they dislike our current culture of transient, unstable relationships. And I wanted to see if I could get a reaction to that.
Well, I don't see any survey data that women have the opinions that you say you do.
No, I cited it.
Am I answering? I'm sorry, am I answering?
Guys.
Okay, pardon me.
Okay.
Pardon me.
All right. So first of all, just on another point, because I did have some data here that I wanted to cite. A study published in the Journal of Sexual Research in 2014 found that although young people today are more likely to have sex with a casual partner, stranger, or friend than their counterparts were 30 years ago, they actually don't have many more sexual partners than their parents did. They compared surveys on sexual practices from 88 to 96 to one from 2004 to 2012, and the researchers found that later survey respondents did not report more sexual partners after the age of 18 than respondents from the earlier survey. In fact, most people were still having sex with a regular partner rather than with random people. So in particular, in 78.2% of those reported that their sexual partner was a spouse or significant other, compared to 84.5% in the 1980s. And they actually chalk this up to the fact that people are marrying later, because marriage rates are actually, you know, like people are getting married later in life. So just on that point really quick. In terms of happiness, as a social scientist, I can tell you measures of happiness are a very difficult thing. And that's because happiness is subjective. It's hard enough, you know, researchers work very hard to get objective measures of happiness. Objective measures of things. Something as subjective as happiness changes over time. The conception of what it is, the components of the measures, the way that the things are applied. But let's even just stipulate that women report that they're less happy now. It might be the case that women are less happy now because they're having to do more work. They're having to do more work because before they were liberated and allowed to go and pursue careers they enjoyed, they took care of the domestic chores. But when women entered the workforce, men didn't pick up the slack in the household, so women ended up doing twice as much work. This is a case where it's not a problem of feminism. This is a case of equitable distribution of labor within relationships. And so I think we're seeing increasingly that relationships where you have gender equality, where people feel that they're equally participating, are happier. And I think that this is very important to understand what might be a source of women's unhappiness. This goes back to the whole issue of the core value of equity and fairness and bodily autonomy, but more about fairness and about equal treatment, that we inherit this notion that women should take care of the domestic sphere. We need to rethink that as much as we used to think that it was not the place of women to be in the public and employment spheres. So in terms of that, I would certainly say that even if women are reporting less overall happiness, depending on what the metrics are, we don't know, I think that those problems are solvable, and they're not solvable by rolling back the clock and narrowly defining and taking marriage rights. I don't know if you're proposing this, but it sounds like you're really more focused on marriage between a man and a woman. And of course, marriage is much bigger now. Families are much bigger now, and I embrace that change. And I think that a loving two-parent family is a great place for kids to grow up. And I'm done.
Yeah, I need to follow up there really quickly because Christy said that I cited this with no evidence. In fact, I gave two sources. This was The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness, published in the American Economic Journal in 2009. And there was a repeat study done several years later that confirmed that women, I guess it confirmed that women and men both had declining happiness. So I guess it didn't completely repeat just female happiness is decline. But, I think, the idea that this is more work, it's actually confronted by Stephenson and Wolfers in their paper. And through a variety of metrics, they are not able to repeat the effect by saying, well, if we take into account controlling for hours worked, there isn't really a lot of effect on declining female happiness. And it looks like the main culprit is relationship stability. Right? Not marriage, not overwork, relationship stability. But like I said from my previous sources, relationship stability has declined due to the increase in these pathological sexual behaviors, like having a large number of lifetime sexual partners. So I just wanted to clarify that point.
Okay, Christy, do you have a rebuttal to that one or a response to that one for the cross?
Well, again, I'm just looking at the data right here, and we're finding, in terms of young people today, they're not having any more sex than their parents were at the same time. So, if you can cite specific numbers on increasing number of sexual partners in the last 40 years, I don't know if you have that data, but yeah, go ahead.
I do have that data, right? We can see from broad surveys of sexual behavior from looking for the source, Teachman 2003, that the number of lifetime sexual partners increased substantially between 1970 and 2000. Now, I think what you're...
Wait, what's substantially?
Well, I could search into the document to get the specific number. Okay, hold on, let me search here.
I think substantially isn't the number to me. So if it doubled,
I understand, but the limited time frame of the debate kind of makes it difficult for to.
I understand. There's also the issue, of course, that people are getting married later, which I don't know if that controls for the fact that people are getting married later and later, and you have more opportunity to have sex if you get married at 32 than if you do at 18. So that's another possible control variable that I would want to know about.
Okay,
here's
so
the explanation of your children are seeing pardon me, the explanation of your children are seeing worse, no less promiscuity than their parents. Well, that's largely a generational shift because children now, their parents were people who grew up in the 70s. Right, so obviously you'd see by comparing children to their parents as the generations shift forward past the sort of event horizon of the sexual revolution, but that statistic will lose resolution on the particular effect you're trying to capture here, right? Just by the comparison, because at some point your parents are going to be post-sexual revolution parents. And indeed, for children of this particular time period, their parents were, for the most part, post-sexual revolution parents.
Right,
okay, and I have...
Okay.
My data from 2014 says right here, survey respondents did not report having more sexual partners after the age of 18 than respondents from the earlier survey. These are comparing people who grew up in 88 to 96, so people like me, compared with people from 2004 to 2012. And they don't see a rise in sexual partners with people under the age of 18. So the sexual partner increase must be happening after people are grown-ups, in which case they're grown-ups. Leave them alone.
Okay, so let's see. Let's let him find
my statistic here is that The number of sexual partners people reported having has increased. Quote, the total number of sexual partners since age 18 increased from 17.17 in the late 80s, 11.42 for men, 3.54 for women, to 11.22 in the 2010s and 18.22 for men, 5.55 for women. So that's a pretty, that's about a 30% increase in number of sexual partners between 80.
Wait, let him finish.
I want to split it up by men and women. Okay.
Well, okay. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Christy, maybe you could answer this question. I mean, I have four sources that show an increased number of sexual partners. I need to ask a question, a point of clarification here. I've got four sources that show that the number of lifetime sexual partners has increased in people from the 50s to their current age. What would be enough to satisfy this particular criterion of yours?
Well, I think that there's a really easy way to answer this question and answer the question I had for you, which is when you gave those numbers, I tried to write them down, but I missed them. Did men's sexual partners numbers go up faster, more than women's?
Well, well, obviously, women's sexual partners are much lower. The median.
Right. So the women start. Yes, the median started at. Right? Right. But can you just give this details to humor me? What did women start at, and what did they end at? What did men start at, and what did men end at?
11 to 18 for men, 3 to a little over 5.5 for women.
So the problem really is men, isn't it? In this case, it's not women having more.
Yes. 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 I agree with you. But that's my whole point. My whole point is the sexual revolution took pathologies in men and exported them to women.
Right, well, we don't see that in your
data. I wish Christy, I wish the sexual revolution helped men become more like women in being more traditional towards their sexual attitudes. I wish that were the case, but that's manifestly not what actually happened in the actual sexual revolution and the actual second wave feminist movement, as we see increasingly from all of the data I've cited.
Right, but women went up 2 and men went up 7. So your average, you can't, so you take that whole average, it makes it look like women, women are equally responsible for this massive shift when really they're responsible
let Christy finish.
Okay. Right. So, when we talk about the problems of sexual revolution, you tend to feminize the problem. You tend to make the problem women. You tend to make the problem a female problem. You tend to make the problem a deficiency in women. And your own data here, in terms of your main argument, shows you that the people you need to be directing your arguments toward are men.
Christy. So, okay, sorry. When are you done?
Yeah, that's. I don't know how much time we have left in the cross-examination.
Well, I need to respond to that accusation.
1 minute left. So,
okay, I need to respond to that accusation. Christy, what are you talking about? In my opening argument, I explicitly called out the sexual revolution for its masculinization effects on the sexual culture. I made absolutely, positively no reference to women. The only time I made a particular reference to women was women as victims of the sexual revolution in terms of their declining happiness. But I was incredibly clear that the problem of the sexual revolution was a masculinization of sexual practices. I absolutely do not feminize. I masculinize the problem because that's where the problem is.
What I've got here in my notes is overwork plus promiscuity. That's the impact that, because I was taking notes on your opening statement, and that's where that came from, was that what feminism has brought women is being stressed out, overworked, and promiscuous. That's where I pulled that from.
Overwork and promiscuity makes everybody unhappy. Men used to do it more than women, and the sexual revolution made women do it a lot more than they used to do it. Look, I'm not. It's to me. It made men do it more too.
Okay, so the first 20-minute batch is up, but there were set for 2 20-minute batches of cross-examination. So shall we continue the cross-examination?
Can we not? I'm getting tired.
No, I think
go to 30 minutes of Q&A.
Guys, clarification, Michaela. The 20-minute cross-examination block was supposed to be shared, like we just did.
Okay.
They were supposed to go back and forth during it. Now we should go on to the next area of the debate if we want to keep this within the idea of like an hour and a half or whatever.
Okay, so that is 30 minutes for question and answers.
And here, I think JP is going to help us sort of. Well, I guess either of the moderators can ask us questions, or they can take questions from the chat.
Yeah, I'll look in the chat for questions. Let's see. I guess I got to wait for it to catch up.
Yeah, because unfortunately, a lot of the questions that I've seen so far haven't really pertained to the debate.
Well, the live stream is still showing Dave and Christy during the
Okay.
conversation, so
Well,
we're gonna.
do you have any questions generally for us, Micah or JP?
Actually,
Something
I
we could
do.
discuss? Yeah,
I actually
redirect
do.
the debate to get us on the topic if you think we've gone off of it during our cross-ex.
So one of the big questions that you made and that Christy also made had to do with, even though the numbers have gone up, it seems that it's been going up more for men. So my question to both of you is, do you believe, and I'm going to try to word this as best I can, do you believe that the masculinization of female or women has also has basically led to the decline in happiness over time due to the sexual revolution? And what are your thoughts on that?
Should I answer? I think that's very clear that this is one of the main effects. And I would trace it like this. I would say that the sexual revolution led to relationship instability. It led to people working more and spending less time in family communities. And that resulted in less happiness. Definitely for women, maybe for men, depending on which studies you look at. Can I ask a point of order? JP, do you want to mute yourself when you're not talking?
Oh, am I making noise?
Yeah, it is. Okay, so go ahead and answer.
Okay, well, I did my doctoral thesis looking at measures of gender compared to measuring a biological sex, how people identify male or female as predictive of political attitudes. And one thing I've learned is that gender isn't a binary, it's a spectrum. When we talk about what is masculinization, what we normally associate in our cultures, the measures that have worked, like the BEM sex role inventory, or the measure that I used, which was the personal attributes questionnaire. We associate things like independence, competitiveness, aggressiveness with masculinity, and we associate connectedness and patience and being helpful with femininity. But the fact is that it's not the case that women are purely emotional and connected and would take care of people and don't do any, have no competitive streak, no independence whatsoever. Men and women, trans people, non-binary people, we all blend on these things because we're all unique people. And so I'm actually going to have to kind of call Dave out a little bit here on like on using masculinization as a pejorative, which is kind of weird as a feminist. And I don't want to mischaracterize what you're saying and saying that masculinity is bad. I think what you're saying is that there are elements of masculine norms, and that those are the ones that got put forward, and somehow those are the ones that are tainting our society. One of the things I'd be interested in your closing, if you can address it, is a solution, because I feel like my stuff has a solution, and I would like to see more stuff from you from a solution. But I actually think that it is better for society if we are a bit androgynous when it comes to letting people rise in being who they are. And if there are competitive women who want to go out and be lawyers and just crush the other side, that's awesome. And if we have guys who really are finding it inspiring as teachers and they want to go down and work with first graders because that's when they think the child's brain is really at its most interesting, then I think we should encourage that. So I would sort of reject the idea that the masculinization is necessarily a pathologization. I'm making up a word here. I think that there were a lot of good things that came out of empowering women to speak for themselves. And I think we're seeing a lot of good things came out of feminism when it comes to getting parental time for men with their kids. I'm a big advocate of baby changing facilities in public restaurants and public spaces so dads can take their kids out. I'm a big proponent of paid parental leave for both parents, whether it's 2 women, 2 men, I'm a man and a woman, because I do value parenthood. I don't just value the roles that we've been given as a society. I know I'm talking a lot, so I should shut up here. But basically my point is that I think that it's about the healthy balance of characteristics that are more or less associated with one gender than the other. And also I think it's healthy that those ideas are a bit more fluid than they've been in the past. And I'll stop now.
Okay, and
Should I
Dave,
rebut that, or?
if you wish.
I think that, I think people should be able to choose how they will, how they arrange their lives. I see no reason why we should expect, though, that people should be pushed into career paths that they manifestly don't not want because we think it has to be 50% women and 50% men. People have different preferences manifestly that we see from sociological data, and they should be able to pursue those. And this has really never been controversial, except for this weird push to sort of get this 50-50 representation, which in my opinion is totally misguided. The masculization, to clarify, I was referring to, I don't think masculinity is referring to, was infidelity, instability, and overcommitment to corporate work, which were hallmarks of masculinity right before the sexual revolution. And that was the specific effect that I said people like Erica Zhang and Gloria Steinem and Germaine Greer tirelessly worked to export to women. Now, I think you agree with me that those are bad things. So I think you agree that in many regards, the second wave feminism worked to take those bad things and make them more available to women's manifest detriment. So I don't know. I think, the solution is for people to sort themselves into lifestyles that leads to long-term well-being. And also the solution is to make the data about what long-term thriving is and how long-term thriving can be achieved available to younger people so they can make more informed decisions about their own lives. Right? If they think that cohabitation or single-parent families is something that's going to lead to more stability or more happiness or better outcomes from their children, or even equal outcomes, they are gravely mistaken in face of the vast amounts of data that we've collected over the last 40 years. And I wish that the modern feminist movement would help me get the information about these pathologies out to the people who need to have it in order to make informed and healthy life decisions. Cohabitation, with its increased rates of interpartner violence, its increased rates of infidelity, its decreased outcomes for children, is not a healthy state of affairs. And there's just no question that this form of family organization has largely increased since the incident of the second wave feminist movement and the sexual revolution.
So, David, if I could ask you, if you don't think that there should be so much done to push women's equal distribution based on their percentage in the population into the public sphere, then do you think that people should be pushed into getting married or staying married when they don't want to stay married?
Well, I think that there's manifest evidence to show that marriage has better outcomes for society. Therefore, there would be some justification that this might be a good thing to push on a societal level. However, there's no justification that says some kind of 50-50 distribution of jobs is some kind of utopian goal that needs to be achieved. I think that pushing people into jobs that they don't want or won't make them happy will lead to a less threat. And just so that what the scales can balance up on the demographic, the spreadsheet says that we need 20% more women. I mean, that just doesn't strike me as a very intelligent or a very wise way to run a society, especially when we should be more focused on the.
That's why it doesn't work like that.
Okay.
It never works like that.
Christy, let him finish.
I don't know. I mean, you could argue about how specific people do this, right? But you can find very few statistical discrepancies in the modern world that aren't fastened on by feminist activists as a means of trying to encourage a funding campaign to rectify it through either, regulations or through a public relations campaign to try to encourage people to, unseat a gender imbalance, right?
Well, yeah, when there are 10 guys on the board and you're asking for one woman, yeah, that's unseating a gender balance. But the fact is that quotas just don't work like that. I mean, there will be lawsuits galore. You can barely get diversity issues into university admissions. The idea that people are hiring, a 30% women quota, that just doesn't happen. But getting back to the earlier
I didn't say quota.
Wait. Getting back to your earlier point, do you think the solution is to make it harder for people to get divorced?
I think that depends what you mean by make it harder for people to get divorced. I think that, historically speaking, the ease of no-fault divorces contributed to this decline. So we can say, looking back, I wish we hadn't done that. But that does not necessarily mean that by doing the opposite, you get to put the genie back in the bottle. So we have to be a little bit more intelligent about this, right? We have to think about ways to sort of coax people or nudge people into more permanent relationships where marriages stay together more. And you know what? One of the main statistics that causes marriages to stay together more? Low number of lifetime sexual partners, as I provided by several of my sources. So, you know, again, it's all interrelated. Everything is interrelated. We have stable families growing up. We encourage people to take a low number of lifetime sexual partners, and we can perhaps sort of control for a lot of the problems that emerged in the 70s and 80s due to the sexual revolution.
Right, but what kind of policy?
Well, wait
okay.
a sec.
Well, okay, so we've kind of gone on this line of questioning for a while, and I've been taking down questions for the chat, so I think that's a pretty good place to stop. So I'm gonna. I have questions for Dave and Christy. So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give Dave a question, Christy can answer, and then I'm gonna give Christy a question, and then Dave can rebut, and then we'll just go like that until the block of time is over. So I'm gonna start with Dave, if that's okay with everybody.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so
Keeping
Dave.
track of time, right?
Yeah, there's 20 minutes and 19 seconds.
Okay,
Okay.
excellent.
So I'm going to start with Dave, and I've reworded this question to make it understandable. What would you do about homosexuals in your perfect society, Dave?
Well, I don't know. I don't know why homosexuality really should concern the state at all. I mean, it doesn't typically lead to the formation of new children. So it's really a very minor concern. I think we could discuss ways of dealing with it. You know, but I don't know, like what I guess what has to be decided in terms of right? Like what's the pressing policy? I guess I need a clarification. What's like the pressing policy decision I need to make about homosexuality?
So I
why
guess
do I need to address it?
What the person was talking about is gay marriage. It's basically civil gay marriage, right? That's I think what he was getting at.
I think the idea that marriage is attached to the state, given the fact that we have our particular marriage culture, is ridiculous. I mean, you know, I don't know. I know that's sort of the Ben Shapiro answer, but it's my position on the subject.
Yeah, in terms of, you know, the sexual revolution and other things it led to, we're focusing on feminism, but obviously sexual liberation took place in a lot more communities than just, you know, like the women's rights community. And I'm a big proponent of kids growing up in a family with two parents that love them. So I'm a big supporter of seeing equal, you know, rights when it comes to gay adoption and all rights to gay couples and their families, whether they're biological kids, they're adopted kids, or people they think are their kids. Well, okay, the law doesn't extend to them, but yeah, I think that a stable family life is great for kids, and so yeah, I think that that's important going forward, that those laws are continuing to be liberalized.
Was there any follow-up question to that?
Not really. So here's one for Christy. What exactly did you mean by flourishing? I believe that was in your. This is,
Oh, flourishing. The actual word is eudaimonia. It's a Greek term, goes back to Greek philosophy. It basically, human flourishing are the conditions that basically allow the best outcomes to come forward. So if you go look up eudaimonia. It's Greek. That's my answer.
Was the question perhaps what statistics you used to establish it?
I think that's what they were meaning.
Oh, can you read the question again?
So what the person said exactly is, Christy, what did you mean by women's flourishing? Like, well, I guess, yes, it could be interpreted as what exact statistic. I'm going to see if the person is commenting in the, well, that's going to take too long. So I guess, yes, let's just go with statistics, since that's probably the one that everybody likes.
Well, I gave a lot of statistics in my talk, but obviously women don't have to go into the classifieds ad anymore and only look at jobs that are offered for women, which is what was happening before the sexual revolution. Women can actually control the time and spacing of their pregnancies, which allows them to make sure they only have kids they can afford, which is why we saw a link, not obviously contraception isn't perfect and some people don't use it, but we did see a decline in public welfare need as a result of the introduction of family planning programs. So women being able to, go to college, to start off in a career, to be able to balance having kids with a career. These are the things that I think women, it's what their dreams are. They want to grow up, they want to have a job they enjoy, they want to have somebody that they love, and they may want to raise a family. And that's what I think flourishing is in that case, whatever makes them happy.
Okay, Dave, do you have any?
Yeah, I do. I mean, if it's flourishing you're after, and that's happiness, I think the happiness statistics of women's lived experiences speak for themselves, that we cited and show market decline in that metric. So,
and men's.
I guess, well, depending on what study, right? We know they're going down. The controversy is whether everyone's getting equally miserable or whether this is a phenomenon more pronounced in women. And it kind of goes back and forth on that point. I guess I don't really care. I guess I don't look at a negative statistic like that and go, well, did women suffer more, or which gender's fault is it? Which gender really suffers? And then form my opinion. I see a decline in happiness, a decline in thriving, and go, that's bad, regardless of whose fault it is or who suffers. It's human suffering. It should be counted as human suffering.
Okay,
yes,
so
for myself, just to follow up on the thing, I think that, with workforce participation, women should have the ability to decide for themselves what they like. But I think you see a lot of times that workforce participation was going up well before the sexual revolution. So.
Oh yeah, they need it for the war effort, definitely. And when women were introduced after the war effort, most of them left, but some of them stayed, sure.
Okay, so next question.
The next question I have, I believe, I asked Dave the question. I asked Christy. So Dave, we're kind of short on questions for you. So I guess I'll just ask basically, what I had that written down somewhere.
I've got a couple that were taken down.
Well, go ahead. If you have questions for Dave, ask them, because I'm short on those.
Yeah. So this question was actually to both, but let's have Dave go first. What happens when people don't have equal opportunity to achieve?
Oh, what happens when people don't have equal opportunity is sort of this naturally hard thing to track, right? Because okay, well, if a person grew up in an unstable family or a broken home, would that be an unequal opportunity? Right? So, I guess we try to rectify these things. We try to make sure that people have the best outcomes. Personally, I care more about absolute thriving than achieving some kind of equality, right? If everyone becomes equally miserable, really, equality is secondary to the absolute standard. Now, men had, I'll put it this way, this is a good thing. Men had less happiness than women before the sexual revolution. And if the original 2009 paradox of declining female happiness is true, women's increasing misery forms an equalization of that metric of thriving. Now, with men being more or less stable. Now, do I regard that as good? That okay, because women are more miserable, that makes them more equal to men, so equality good, so that's a good metric. No, I just see I see bad outcome. And the first response is, let's fix the bad unequal outcome before I take out my middle caliper and make sure that, the levels on the spreadsheet are all at 50%. So did I answer the question? Maybe I didn't.
I felt that you did to what was given for the question, so. Christy, do you have an answer?
Can you restate the question just so I make sure I have the wording accurate?
Yeah, give me just one moment.
Yeah, sorry.
What happens when people don't have equal opportunity to achieve?
There are the bits of the content of David's response I disagree with, but the overall idea about equal opportunity being one thing and outcomes being another. Obviously, not even having the opportunity is a huge problem. And I think that's one of the things that, has been challenged under the sexual revolution, even though we're maybe thinking outside of it in terms of more of the women's participation and other forms of impact, at least having the opportunity to compete. If you don't have that, then your whole life is is basically going to be determined by other people and not by yourself and your circumstances and coincidences of fate. But yeah, I'll move on because I think there may be other questions. Dave already kind of addressed the conceptual difference of equal opportunity and other outcomes. So,
I could add something here. I mean, I think that when you talk about things like people being barred from equal opportunity, the incredibly high single mother rate in the Black community is one of the main contributing factors to the fact that African Americans don't have equal opportunity. And that it's from when we first noticed it in 1965 with the Moynihan Report. That increase, that dissolution of the Black American family has been one of the chief ways that equality of opportunity has never fully been granted. So even if you are obsessed with equal opportunity, I think that you see the sexual revolution, again, starting in 1965 with the Moynihan Report, uniformly lead to bad outcomes when it comes for the particular question of African American equal opportunity in America.
Okay, JP, do you have one for Christy, or do you want me to grab the next that was for both of them?
Well, I do have one for Christy. I couldn't, again, the chat is sort of light on questions for everybody, but I hear, Christy, why do you support the idea of a gender spectrum? Or why do you believe in the idea of a gender spectrum? Why do you believe gender is on a spectrum?
Because we observe it. Like I said, I used measures of gendered attitudes that have been developed by psychology, including issues of, like competitiveness. So here's a question, if you're talking about the social construction, how societies build up what are proper gender roles, or if you're talking about identity. So this is—
Just to clarify, I think they were speaking specifically about gender roles when I wrote this down. So basically, why do you sort of believe that gender roles were constructed the way they were?
Well, that's a really long story. It starts in the Bible, where women are property and men have all the power. And so the division of power and the division of status and the division of work was set, 6,000 years ago. At least that's the written version. I mean, it probably preceded that. And ever since, societies have basically worked off that base model, I think, until really now we're starting to, with postmodernism, deconstruct this binary. And the other thing that we talked, one thing I did want to bring up is opportunities. And one thing that I think feminism has really done in empowered families is to elevate the nurturing role and the role of fathers. Again, I'm a big proponent of public nappy changes, diaper changing places that are unisex, so any parent can use them. I'm a big proponent of parental leave. But in terms of those roles, you can just observe society and you will see what is meant to be a masculine gender role. You can look at action hero movies, right? And women are just decorations. They don't have any content. It's all about the guy and his ego. And then women are given roles that they're supposed to be mothers and carers and self-negating and give everything up for their families, and that they should get their satisfaction from everybody else's happiness. That's a self-negation that's really demanding on people. So, I think if you just read the literature in terms of gender roles in a society, there are various opinions on what they are, but there's kind of some core cultural elements that change depending on what culture that you're in, which is another way to know that it's socially constructed. It doesn't remain fixed over time. So,
I think I might have some additional information on that point. If I could come in?
Go for it.
I think that when we look back to like these ancient societies and older societies than our own, we really have to be careful with superimposing our own modern concepts on them, right? And you see this especially with this whole patriarchy stuff, with like the idea that to work is a privilege. So we go back to things like, 19th century and biblical times, our notions of work being a privilege are totally not true. Not working was the privilege, right? So you see a lot of times what we do when we look back and look for sort of these oppression narratives in societies that are 100, 200, 300, 2,000 years before ours, you see a lot of projection, where people project modern notions on who's privileged and who's not onto social patterns that are not really fully understood in their proper context. And so I wanted to sort of shoehorn that in.
Christy, let him finish. Let him finish.
Oh, actually, let's. I want to hear the answer. So I was done for that particular edition.
Okay.
Well, we know that women were raped You know, I mean, the instructions are there, and they weren't given because men, they were given because men had disputes over how to divvy up the women that they would have for sex slaves. So, I mean, I think, you know, we have evidence of this kind, you know, from the texts themselves. And in terms of the flipping around, if it's not right for us to look back and judge history based on what our values are today, well, then it's equally inappropriate to adopt values from a Bronze Age culture and say this is how we should live our modern society with our understanding of science and biology and economics and everything else today. So it kind of works in both directions.
Okay, so we've got 9 minutes and 30 seconds left.
So I guess I'll ask maybe one or two more questions. So the last one was for Christy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this one is for Dave. Dave, what makes complementarianism to you better than the idea of absolute equality that Christy sort of espouses?
Well, the first one is that absolute equality is a chimera that will never be achieved. It's totally utopian in its inception, and even the idea that we can obtain equal opportunity in some absolute sense when we go beyond explicit laws and rules and institutions becomes totally unachievable. But also, we see a certain amount of gender complementarity inside biology. And because of that, I think that complementarity is sort of a natural response to that. I don't think complementary relationships should be enforced, but I think people seek them out. And I think that if that's the family structure they are using to achieve thriving, as I think their marriage rates and the increased good effects from marriage indicate, then I would say that's one reason for complementary gender relationships or complementary sex relationships, as I mean it.
Okay, and Christy, do you have anything?
I don't. No. We'll just move on. Sorry, it's going on 9 o'clock for me, so I'm starting to get a little bit tired. Not quite 9, but yeah.
Okay, so I guess we'll make this the last question then. So I guess sort of with all of the negative statistics that Dave brought up about specifically the African American community and what has happened to them since the sexual revolution, do you believe that the sexual revolution is responsible for that? And if it's not, then what is, in your opinion?
I think that the only
Dave, that was for Christy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I know that's okay. Well, and I know that Dave brought that up. I didn't focus on that subset and that data. I think there are a lot of things that happened in the African American community related to issues of racism, poverty, systematic racism, state oppression that continues to this day. So I think there are issues around the incarceration, the systematic incarceration of Black youth, the way that men are taken out of society because, let's say, for instance, marijuana use among whites and Blacks is the same, but a Black youth is 3 times more likely to be arrested and put in prison for possession of marijuana. That's then on his record. He can't get student loans. It ruins his life. So there's a whole problem of the state interfering in the lives of Black men by criminalizing their behavior, putting them in a for-profit industry, prison industry that is funded by taxpayers' expense to shift money into the pockets of those private prison owners. And this is a system that's going all the way back into the early, since Jim Crow. So yeah, there might be an issue of sexuality, but let's face it, the women who most depend on Planned Parenthood, women who are really advocates for it, are women in the African American community, because white women who live in areas where they have options, and poor white women and Black women and other women who need those services, Planned Parenthood is a lifeline. And if you want to destroy those women's lives, if you want to make life harder for kids and women in America, the best way to do that is defund Planned Parenthood, because it is precisely the women who can't afford these services and need it, that Planned Parenthood provides it for, and so our society is so much better off for it. So I know that there's an issue of marriage. I have to say, I understand that a lot of people like the idea of marriage. I live in Europe, where marriage rates are declining, and we see a lot of partnerships, and we see a lot of people getting married very civilly. I think that's the direction that people are moving. And let me just conclude on this issue. we now live until our 80s. We live for decades. And if we go back and we look at humans' marriage patterns over time, there is something we can observe. Human beings as a species, we generally are serial monogamists. I'm reading the book, a biography of Bess of Hardwicke. She was a contemporary of Elizabeth I, and she was an amazing woman. She ended up owning property and being a really big badass. But she was married at 17. Her husband died the next year. She got married again, stayed married for 15 or 20 years, then that husband died, and she married for a third time. Margaret Beaufort was married at least 4 times. So what we see, if we go back in human history, people weren't on the average, married for 70 years anymore. The reason why we see divorce rates in some cases is that we're living longer and we change over time. If we had been moved this all back 200 years ago, instead of getting divorced, one of the people would have died. So, I think that there is a change in the pattern, but the change in the pattern is more cosmetic. What we're seeing is a modern way of organizing families. And I think we're going to look back and see that this has had not nearly just completely detrimental consequences. And if I could just speak, and this isn't statistical, it's just anecdotal. My parents, and they got together, they were 18, no, they were 21. But they were young and they had me pretty quick after they got married. They didn't get along at all. They had my brother, still didn't get along, and they ended up divorcing. Both of them ended up marrying people who made them much happier. And you know what? I noticed when I was 13, because it was very rare for my mom and my stepfather to have a fight. But they were having a fight, one that very unusually, they raised their voices. And I realized myself that I had tuned out their argument, but I was using a mechanism that I hadn't used in years, because that was what I used to do when my mom and dad would fight when I was a little kid. And I hadn't had to do it for so long, I forgot I could do it. And I think that even if we want to talk about the overall statistics and the averages, that's fine. But there are anecdotes, there are people's lives who, when they get that second marriage, it's way better. And the kids are way better off. And I don't want to discount those families. Because in saying, oh, you've gotten married, now you're divorced, you're going to be miserable forever, there are a lot of people who find love a second time. And there are a lot of happy families and blended families that come from it.
Okay, Dave?
Okay, one statistical thing. I mean, I've heard this sort of gray divorce theory of divorces that, we live so much longer than we used to, and therefore how could you possibly expect sort of, people not to get divorced? But this doesn't really hold up with the facts. One thing, it's a statistical mistake on how lifespans have increased. Lifespans largely in the 19th and 20th century shot up from like 30 to 80, not because people never lived into their 80s in the 19th century, but largely because infant mortality went down. So it's not true that people didn't live into their 70s and 80s as married in the 19th century. What changed was people's attitudes towards the institution, where there was a shift in focus from the family and community and the sacrifice of the marriage onto the personal fulfillment. And again, that change was largely accomplished in the sexual revolution.
If I could just come back on there. I wasn't saying that everybody...
We're almost out of time, actually.
Okay. It just had to do with rates of death and people going off to war, but that's okay. It's all right. We'll move on then.
Okay, so we're moving on to the final part, the final summaries. Who would like to go first?
I'll let Dave go first. I think it was my choice, right?
Yes.
Yes, it's your choice. You can choose.
So whenever you're ready.
So let me arrange myself here a little bit. Okay. Just tell me when to begin.
Whenever you're ready, I'll start the timer.
I think we've seen in this debate is largely an agreement. We largely agree on the fact that the increasing nature of these effects that we saw starting in the sexual revolution, like increased cohabitation, increased number of lifetime partners, an increased number of cohabitation in single-parent families, had huge detrimental impacts. What seems to be sort of the contention on the floor is or other knock-on effects, or other secondary effects that sort of the sexual revolution kind of confronted. But I think that really that misses the point. The point is that the main effect of this social change was overwhelmingly negative. It was overwhelmingly negative for the thriving of women, as evidenced. It was overwhelmingly negative for the equal opportunity of African Americans, probably leading to many of the pathologies that we see manifesting in an increased incarceration rate. And it was overwhelmingly not positive for another generation of American children who carried forth a lot of the negative consequences of the sexual revolution into their own generation. And so, I mean, I guess I'm just going to return to the original question I had. Given that the main part of this data, not that there weren't bad things that happened in the past, I'm fully aware that there were particular abuses, there were particular unfairnesses in the actual past, as there always are. People will look back on our age and think there are particularly unfair things going on that need to be reformed. But if we look at the specific effect of the sexual revolution, the specific effect of people treating sexuality as basically a means of seeking pleasure and not as something that's meant to form into a long-term family, overwhelmingly the consequences are negative, and overwhelmingly the second wave feminist movement supported this effect. All we have to contradict this is sort of notions that, well, maybe something bad happened, that in the past that we corrected, and also kind of ironically, a hope that all of the effects that the sexual revolution directly caused will be slowly undone through the use of birth control, contraception, and other effects of increasing wealth. And I guess, aside from sort of minor statistical blips, I see really no evidence of this. And so I'm left asking myself, I mean, is this sort of the response that the feminist movement, the modern feminist movement, has to this problem, right? Is it a response to all of these issues? Increased psychological harms for children, increased cognitive difficulties for children, falling apart families, unhappy adults. Is the response to lived experiences of African Americans and women just, it's going to get better, stay the course of Planned Parenthood, pray that the blip we saw post-recession in 2009 is going to carry forward and we're going to see a huge upswing in marriage, even though we haven't seen it in the last 40 years. Just hope that that's going to make a difference. Because if that's the case, it seems that the modern feminist movement does not have a very realistic or data-driven answer. And it seems that they're really hiding from the core realities of the sexual revolution that their predecessors worked to bring about. Now, I have a lot of contact with feminists in my own life, just intellectually online. And I bring this data to them. And again, I get sort of a lot of hopes, a lot of pointing to specific harms that don't really address the main effect of the trend. And no real addressment of the issue. And I'm sort of left wondering why the Academy hasn't addressed this. And I think that after all of this, after all the evidence, we have to conclude that this comes down to academic bias. As documented by people like Jonathan Haidt, as documented by other people who have looked at this issue, the academia who studies this is overwhelmingly progressive, and the progressive movement is in bed with these changes. They're invested in them. And because of that, they cannot directly critique these results. And so we're left with a progressive movement that has a disaster on its hand, a disaster of epic proportions for the next generation. And really, they're more interested in making sure that they're not blamed for it than they are in addressing the issue at its source. And the source is the change in sexual behaviors and attitudes that drove to the destruction of the family over the last 40 years. So I'll end with that.
All right, I guess that's me then. I'll just start my timer. I don't know if I'll need my whole 5 minutes, but
okay,
go.
Right. Start when you're ready.
So again, thank you both for the debate. It's been very interesting, very invigorating. I've had quite a nice time, and I hope people have enjoyed it at home as well. So when I can reflect back on Dave's comments, there are some things that stand out in terms of the debate. Now, again, remember that we're debating whether or not the sexual revolution has made life better for people in American societies. And it seems to me that some of the biggest problems that Dave has identified isn't so much feminism, it's men's behavior. So he talked about the masculinization and the way that that can pathologize people's behavior. He noted that in one of the studies he used, men were actually less happy than women, and then women kind of got all stressed out, and then there's been some equality. But that problem of men's happiness is also something that I think is we haven't really unpacked that much. We also saw that men were having more sexual partners, and this problem of promiscuity is primarily the increase in the numbers can be tied back to the increase in male sexual partners. In terms of single parent families, he didn't make the comment, but obviously that implies that the men in those women's lives are not there for the kids in a meaningful way. So I'm I'm not really seeing, I know he's got a lot of data, but I'm not really seeing the link between all of his problems and feminism. I think we're looking at societal problems that really have more to do with men's behavior, not so much with the women's movement. What has the women's movement really done to improve life in American society? Well, that's easy. We saw that, I showed you this, or mentioned the statistics that with no-fault divorce, women's suicide rates declined by 20%, and it's estimated that women's murder rates were also declined by 10%. We saw that marital rape was finally, when feminists started to act on it, it didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't special or magic or just suddenly people had a revelation. It was the work of feminists to make marital rape a crime. And it's still issues like in North Carolina with issues of rape even today. Domestic abuse was an issue that was very important, that came out of the sexual revolution, and making the public private, stopping violence in the home as being something that was other people's business and we don't really want to get involved, to understanding that harm, the harm to children, for instance, and the harm to families. That's right down to feminism. The focus on sex education and giving people the ability to have medically accurate information about their bodies and their sexual health. This is something that I know I as a feminist still advocate for today, and it's being met with resistance with state education boards around the country. So there's really no conflict between feminism and marriage. There's no conflict between feminism and parenthood. These ideas aren't inherently conflicted just because people in society are behaving one way. The blame for this should not go back to feminism. It seems to me that what I'm offering in terms of this debate and the solution is a set of values and principles that I know guide my decisions when I'm looking at the challenges that face our society. These are equal treatment, fairness, and bodily autonomy. These are the things that I value. And the question for me is, what can I do in our society to enhance those things, to make sure that there is more equality, more fairness, more making sure that people's bodily autonomy is not violated. So in closing, I'm going to be very brief here. Again, I want to thank both our moderators. I want to thank Dave. And to you, the viewing audience, I just would ask you, when you're considering what has been discussed today, is to reflect on the core issues. You know, do you want to live in a society where people are treated equally? Do you want to live in a society where there is fairness, and that fairness is inclusive, so that there are many ways to be fair and that many people have access to it? And do you respect bodily autonomy? Do you think that we should be shaming women for having sex but making men into studs? That was the dynamic that existed before the sexual revolution. I personally think that we're having better sex, we're having more sex, we're having healthier sex, and we're having sex, more knowledgeable sex, as a consequence of the work of feminists and other people who promoted the idea that our bodies are not something to be ashamed of. Instead, they should be understood, they should be respected, and sometimes, you know, even celebrated in art and in life. So with that, I will close my remarks.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to both of you for having this debate. And thank you to JP for helping moderate and ask the questions. And I would like to thank the audience for taking the time out of their day to come and listen to this. And I believe if there are any follow-up questions, they can be asked on Dave's channel. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, go ahead. It will be open comments. I never censor my comments. So.
Okay. And with that, I believe we are done for today for this debate. So
great. Thank you very much, Christy and Makea, and also JP. Have a wonderful day.
thank you.
All right, guys, take it easy.
All the best.